Welcome to the Michael Ratner Report on the Real News Network. As you know, Michael Ratner is the President Emeritus of the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Sharmini, it's always good to be with you and the Real News.
So, Michael, what's in your notebook today for us?
Well, there's a lot going on, but today I want to talk about what for a number of years I referred to as the Palestine exception to the First Amendment, or the Palestine exception to free speech. And what I mean by that is that you can talk about almost anything in the United States and political speech is protected, except, in fact, when it comes to Palestine. And what prompts me to talk about it was a recent article in the New York Times that essentially, if you read it, and I'll get to that, talks about anti-Semitism and the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement at Stanford University. And I'll tell you why that's important, because that's the way they smear the boycott, divestment, sanction movement, is by claiming it's anti-Semitic. Advocates of the boycott, divestment, sanction movement, or people who criticize Israel for the occupied territories, particularly at universities, are harassed, smeared, special rules are applied, they're disciplined more than others. And worst of all, as I indicated, their criticism of Israel, and particularly the push for boycott, divestment, and sanction, is claimed to be anti-Semitic. It's a particular charge of great potency, of course, because of the Holocaust. It cuts off debate on the issue, and it's implying, really, that people who are anti-Semitic are people who would have more or less participated in the Holocaust. It's an absurd charge, of course, because we're talking about a state and not a person. And since when can protesting an occupation that much of the world agrees is illegal be anti-Semitic? But unfortunately, we're seeing more and more of it. I think part of it is the reaction to the growing boycott, divestment, and sanction movement. It's having a real effect. Universities across this country, in the United States, across Europe, and it is one way of perhaps getting Israel to change its policies. My focus for today, though, is this article that appeared in the New York Times recently, in which very questionable claims of anti-Semitism by supporters of boycott, divestment, and sanction were given high publicity. It's what I call the Stanford case. It's noticeable, and the Stanford case typifies coverage of this, is that those types of claims, anti-Semitism, when it comes to people who protest Israel, are given high publicity. But the suppression of the advocates of changes in Israel, of BDS, are not given such attention, when in fact, that is what is going on at college campuses all over this country. The scores of suppression of speech by advocating for Palestine is well documented, but not known widely in the public. There's a project set up called the Palestine Solidarity Legal Support Project. It's a website, it's palestinelegalsupport.org. And that's where it's documented the suppression of speech on Palestine. And that organization as well gives legal representation to people. But here's what occurred a few days ago in the New York Times. Here's the headline. The headline is, Student Coalition at Stanford confronts allegations of anti-Semitism. Huge half-page article with a giant picture of the Jewish student who claimed anti-Semitism. The claim was this. She was being interviewed for an endorsement, because she's running for some campus office, by a coalition of students of color. And she claims she was asked if her being Jewish affected her views of the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement. Now, I understand how if she was asked, because you're Jewish, does that affect your views? That might be seen by some as anti-Semitic, because it's a stereotype. And of course, many Jews actually do support BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction. Jewish Voice for Peace has thousands of members who support it. But the real question in that article and the wide publicity is, was her claim true? Was she asked that question if being Jewish affected her views? And did it warrant such coverage? The first 5 paragraphs of the article would let you think the story was 100% true because they only talk about her story, her thoughts about it, etc. And most people don't read beyond the headlines in the early paragraphs. Only when you reach the 6th paragraph does the Times tell us that this claim is denied by 9 members of the coalition who did the interview, saying it didn't happen and it was baseless. And then after that denial, the New York Times slyly bolsters the Jewish students' claim by a quote from the Anti-Defamation League, calling it a teaching moment about Jewish identity, as if the incident itself had occurred. In other words, they sandwiched the denial between 6 paragraphs in front of it and paragraphs behind it. So we get this story with a headline and a photo, leaving the impression of anti-Semitism on campus and in the BDS movement. This is all a means of suppressing growing movement. Although, to put it mildly, that story has been heavily disputed by the 9 students on the coalition. They've turned over the entire notes of that meeting to the university authorities, etc. So it's a questionable story, to say the least. But as I said, what is actually happening are huge efforts to suppress supporters of BDS and critics of Israel, and that is not covered. It's not mentioned, but ignored. Let me give you some examples of Palestine legal solidarity of the hundreds of complaints that they have received. First of all, there are claims to try and define anti-Semitism, so it includes protests against Israel, violations of human rights by Israel, and support for BDS. California, this was a couple of years ago, passed a House resolution that defined anti-Semitism to, quote, include language or behavior that demonizes, delegitimizes Israel, and student faculty BDS campaigns or claims that Israel is an apartheid state. And just recently, the UCLA Student Council passed an analogous resolution condemning anti-Semitism, but also the definition that silenced critics of Israel. It's what we call the 3 Ds: the demonization of Israel, the delegitimization of Israel, or applying a double standard. Of course, one can define those terms any way one wants to. And of course, it would include things like BDS, criticizing the occupied territories, etc. So demonization through anti-Semitism is one method. A second method is what is the Civil Rights Act of the United States, Title VI, which allows the Department of Education to investigate discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. Israel firsters, or Zionists, have gotten that redefined so that it can include discrimination against religious groups based on that religious group's perceived ancestry. Well, who does that arguably apply to? But Jewish people who claim a shared ancestry and therefore bring it into race. Universities in California, Berkeley, Rutgers, Barnard, and others have claimed Palestinian activism on campuses and scholarly lectures critical of Israeli policy created anti-Semitic hostile climate for Jewish students on campus. Those colleges claim to DOE, Department of Education. It's serious because it not only, the complaint alone starts to intimidate people on campus, particularly the university authorities, but of course it could mean the loss of funding, federal funding for universities. In this case, after much litigation, a lot of it supported by the Zionists, and perhaps even the state of Israel, etc., there was a win, not by the Zionists, but by the students, that political speech is protected by the First Amendment. A third, and some recent events I'll mention, and then we'll bring this segment to a close, were some recent events that have happened. Students for Justice in Palestine go around the country, and at universities they are present, proposing divestment resolution on their college campuses. They're met with hostility, claims of anti-Semitism, and administrative barriers. One of many occurred recently, University of Toledo. And when I read these, I have trouble believing them. They proposed the SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, proposed a resolution. The university said there could be no public at the hearing on the divestment resolution, and that SJP people had to sit in a separate room while the opponents were presenting their views. I'm guessing, presumably on the theory that it was a hostile atmosphere. Palestine Legal and others forced the university back, and ultimately one meeting was held and the vote was heavily in favor of divestment. A similar kind of action happened at Northeastern. The executive cabinet of the students blocked any discussion of the resolution. It was beaten back. Ultimately, unfortunately, the resolution failed, but many others are won. A third happening at universities across the country is that students criticizing Israel are not allowed to use the word apartheid to describe what's going on in Israel or to describe the wall they're building on campus as a mock apartheid wall. And they're not allowed to distribute flyers advocating boycotts. Now, all of those are unconstitutional, particularly at public universities, and they're being beaten back. Recently, at Pitzer College in California, the administration came down with a ruling that they couldn't put up a wall, an apartheid wall, as a symbol because it would trigger complaints and it would harm the aesthetics of the college. Hard to believe all of this stuff, but that's what's going on. Lastly, in this area, there's anti-boycott legislation going on. States like Illinois are trying to prohibit investments by any state entity in companies that support boycott, divestment, and sanction. And there's federal legislation by even very liberal members of Congress trying to limit the ability to do boycott, divestment, and sanction. This, what I've been speaking of, is focused in the U.S., but of course it's happening elsewhere at all. But one thing I think is important to understand, we have to take it as a symbol of strength of the BDS movement. The Israel right or wrong, which is what I call people who support Israel, no matter what its human rights violations, are worried. BDS is growing. And young people at college campuses across this country can't understand that if human rights are universal, why is Israel somehow exempted? And there is a great fight back on campus to support BDS suppression. Palestine Legal and others are fighting what I'm referring to as the Palestine exception to the First Amendment.
Michael, as always, thank you so much for joining us, and we will look forward to linking some of the findings that you have uncovered in this interview, just below the interview right here.
Shamini, thank you for having me on The Real News.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News Network.